Now, here on the show, it's my honor to welcome author, professor of African American literature and culture, and director of graduate studies in the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh, Michael E. Sawyer, who has written a really neat new book on Sir Lewis Hamilton, a biography, and I have lots of questions. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks a lot, Bob. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book.
Okay. I understand from the materials that came with the book that you are a lifelong Formula One fan. Is that true?
Pretty much lifelong, adult lifelong. So I was in the
Mhm.
Navy before I joined academia. I was first stationed in Naples, Italy in 1990. So I made it up to the Italian Grand Prix in 1990. So I've been attending Formula One races since, that one. So that was a really eye-opening experience for me.
You, I noticed that the book took something like 5.5 years to write. I guess what was interesting to me is Lewis is now, with all that he's accomplished, approaching the end of his career. Why write the book now? Why not wait just a few more seasons until he hangs up his helmet?
Yeah, I think a couple of reasons. First off, when we really got to it, it was kind of post the 2021 season. And I think that was a kind of tipping point for his career. In some
Mhm.
ways, I was surprised that I would not have been surprised if he didn't come back after that, after what had happened at Abu Dhabi, frankly. And also, kind of fortuitously, depending upon how you look at it, it kind of with the book coming out now, it kind of bookends his long relationship with Mercedes, and then there's kind of this new start. So, with Lewis Hamilton, you may want to wait until he's 80 when he stops doing stuff. So
Right.
there's really no point because and it was a race against time really because it takes a long time to get books into production. And we were just fortunate enough that the announcement with respect to leaving for Ferrari happened because then the book would have not had that kind of terminus to know that something new was happening right after this. So that's the reason why. And I think it's an opportune time to kind of think about this portion of his career, then situate ourselves to absorb that and be able to think about what's coming next as well. So
With all that's been written and said about Lewis in this long and incredibly accomplished career, what made you decide to write a biography to add to that lexicon about Lewis?
so some of this is comes from my kind of background, as you mentioned, as a professor who works on cultural studies.
Mm-hmm.
So the kind of biographical information is, there are all kinds of people I think who are well equipped to kind of handle that. He was here, he was there, this happened, that happened. What I really want to think about in the book is a series of kind of he, Lewis himself as a cultural phenomenon, and then think about the kind of long term effects of him as an athlete who's an activist in multiple ways, right? The environment, social justice, diversity, whether it's gender, sexuality, race, etc. And also to think about Lewis in the long durée of athletes who have broken boundaries, right? So in that, I'm thinking about Jesse Owens in certain kinds of ways. I'm obviously thinking about Tiger Woods, who changed golf in certain ways. So I think that was in many ways the motivation to take a look at Lewis from a different perspective that I think exceeds the kind of biographical. Because then I'm really concerned about what Lewis thinks he's doing, and then the way the world kind of perceives it and what happens kind of surrounding that, right? So if we think about what happened in 2020 when he had protested against police violence, that was part of a larger cultural milieu that I think can get lost if we only focus on what's happening with him in the four corners of kind of Formula One racing.
Tell us about the distinction you see between figures like Lewis and Muhammad Ali and Arthur Ashe and Colin Kaepernick and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, superstar black athletes who spoke out on issues like civil rights, equal opportunity, the environment, and so forth, and others such as Michael Jordan, who chooses not to.
Right. So yeah, Jordan becomes really important in this conversation, and Tiger Woods in certain ways too, because Tiger has his own ideas about the way he fits into just this kind of genealogy that you proposed. I
Mm-hmm.
think I think I would probably most properly compare Lewis to kind of I'm sorry, to Muhammad Ali most obviously, and
Mm-hmm.
Jackie Robinson as well for someone who breaks kind of a barrier, right? That
Yeah.
a real or imagined type of barrier. And so I think what's different about Lewis and Ali was an international figure in the same way that Lewis is, right? Because, I grew up in Chicago in the 1970s. So Ali was a constant presence in my life. And, my dad took me to see his fight against Larry Holmes on closed circuit television. I cried for 2 days after that because it was so devastating to me. Because for me, Ali was literally a superhero, right? That was, because that was just all I understood about him. And I also understood his that he had spoken out on things that people needed to be paying attention to. So I think part of Lewis fits into that conversation. Well, Kareem obviously is in that area, and then obviously what happened with Kaepernick. But I think it's different about Lewis in that milieu, and again, kind of bracketing Ali from the international perspective. In that milieu, there's the fact of the matter that Lewis cares about things that are outside of his own kind of domestic concerns, right? So you have a person who's from from a town in England someplace who's concerned about what's going on in Brazil, who's concerned about what's going on in Kentucky in America, all these kinds of things where he can very easily, in ways that I think Tiger Woods probably has, cordoned himself off from those kinds of concerns. And there's reason to do that, right? Because being able to pay attention to all those things and be great at your sport and also be able to pay careful attention to these other things is important. I think the difference between Lewis and a person like Colin Kaepernick is that Kaepernick was not at the top of the sport when he started exhibiting his kind of activism. He was doing it from the bench, literally, right? He wasn't playing anymore. He had his run to the Super Bowl, and everyone kind of knew that Colin Kaepernick's best years as a quarterback were probably behind him, right? So what Lewis has done is to do this in a sport where obviously Black people had not been present at all, to do it from a perspective of internationalism, and to do it from the top of the sport and seemingly not be concerned about the effect that might have on his commercial success. And I think when you mentioned Michael Jordan, Jordan was always concerned about his commercial success because he did lots of things from an activist perspective, but he did them in ways that people weren't aware that he was up doing them, right? So he obviously had a careful distance between himself and what he was up to just for that reason. I don't think Lewis cares about that. And I think that's a step forward in the way we understand modern athletes and activism.
I'm glad you mentioned Tiger Woods. Anybody who knows anything about Tiger knows how significant his father, Earl, was in Tiger's development. And you mentioned other fathers of superstar Black athletes like the Williams sisters, Richard Williams and so forth. Talk a little bit about the impact of Anthony Hamilton in Lewis's life, including the fact that at the point Lewis decided to make his own decisions about his career, Anthony seemed to be perfectly willing to step away.
Yeah, I think part of the story here, and also this gets to where we started, is the reason to write the book is there's an important story about fatherhood and parenting that is here too, right? And I think it extends beyond. And I think what's interesting about Lewis's relationship, the way I understand it with his dad, is he always wanted it to extend beyond what they were doing in racing, right? And he always wanted to have. He mentions that these moments where you were just my dad and not these other things. So I think there's a point where any parent has to be able to let to let everything that they told their child be what the child does when they can't be around to kind of affect it, right? I think for Lewis, that played itself out in very public fashion because I think, and I make this argument in the book, that Anthony comes from a very particular generation of Black migrants from the Caribbean, the Windrush. Windrush is kind of post-World War II, who show up in Britain. And he understands a particular way to kind of go about your business, right? There's going to be racism. There's going to be, problems with respect to bigotry, but you do a good job and therefore things will work out for you, right? I think he has Lewis buys into that for a period of time. He does everything he's supposed to. 2007 has the season that we all know he had in his first year. Then he gets to testing in Barcelona 2008 and experiences like this kind of the most kinetic kind of racist practices you could possibly see, right? I think the kind of silence on the silent approach to just doing your business, he realized at that point was not going to be good enough for him as an individual. So I think it's not I don't view it as a break with his dad. I think it's an evolution from his dad's position as to how to go about dealing with these kinds of difficult situations. I think over the years, when you get to kind of 2019 and 2020, Lewis really develops a voice. I think has a lot to do with, again, his kind of international presence in places and spaces where, Formula One drivers are very focused people, right? And Lewis finds time to do a lot of other things. I think that contributed to that too. So when his dad walked away, and I'm not, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. I'm not ever sure that Lewis actually ever hired his dad as a manager. He just was his manager, right? And his dad at the same time, right? There was no interviewing process. It didn't seem to be kind of any coherent business agreement because it really wasn't necessary, right? It was just a relationship between a parent and a child, and there had to be some progress from that. And I think it was, and obviously I don't have to think it. It says it was a very difficult time when they had that break, because this is where things kind of played out for them in the world of racing, was where they experienced both the professional relationship and their personal relationship. For that break to happen, I think was significant. But then when you see these kind of most important moments, like last year at Silverstone, or in 2021 in the final race, his dad is always right there, right? So I think that they figured out how to manage that relationship between the two of them. And I think in many ways, Tiger Woods' dad, some of the stories about the way Tiger Woods' dad trained Tiger are difficult to imagine, right? And I mentioned in the book too, right? In entertainment, you see the same thing with Joe Jackson and his sons, right? This kind of complicated relationship. I think that in many ways, Anthony Hamilton exemplifies the best of those ways of managing this, because it can be very complicated and it's probably not going to work, right? It's like, the chances of this coming off the way it did are basically zero, right? And somehow, they catch this talent and the opportunity and all these kinds of things at the same time. And his dad's drive, and I think it paid off in ways that we all benefit from. But I think it's also an example for any parent who has a child that dreams about anything, whether it's playing an instrument or being a really good math teacher. I think it's the same. Much of that is the same, to kind of explore the lines between parenting and professionalism. I think are important to navigate.
That is definitely the point, and I'm glad you spoke about it so eloquently. This was a family situation that had grown up since Lewis was in single digits, driving go-karts or even playing with his RC cars, as you pointed out. It would seem that Anthony and perhaps Lewis's mom and even his step-parents contributed to creating a complete individual in so many ways. You liken him to the great Jesse Owens in your book, who went to Hitler's Germany, the belly of the beast, in the Olympics in Berlin, and showed through his performance that all of the lies about racial superiority that were being spread were untrue. And there's a great story. I once had the opportunity to hear Jesse Owens speak here in Atlanta before he finally passed away. And he tells the story of a German opponent, competitor, Lutz Long, who also finished on the podium in the long jump. But when Jesse Owens was down to his last jump and he had fouled on every previous attempt, Lutz Long came forward and said, "Here's what I notice you doing. See if you can adjust." And he did, and went on to win the gold medal. Those are the kind of wonderful stories we see in sports from time to time. But getting back to family, Lewis does seem to have such a great relationship with, shall we say, both sides of his family, as well as his brother Nicholas, who is living with a debilitating disease. Does that also come from parenting in your mind?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. I mean, we all either kind of personally or through proxy have experienced families that have to become hybrid families in certain kinds of ways, right? There's all kinds of ways there are very few ways it can go right, and there are all kinds of ways it can go wrong. And I think that they figured out, and what's fascinating is maybe it was racing, right? Because they had something common between them, right? There wasn't the things that are common between all families that are beyond kind of school and just helping the person kind of get that act together. They had that, obviously, but also this other enterprise going on, and and a driven child who was focused in ways that belie his age, right? His maturity from kind of single digits on. It's just fascinating to kind of watch, right? The kind of single point of focus. So I think he becomes the in many ways the gravity in that situation, and even in his relationship with his brother, right? Who who, you know, takes up racing in his own way, right? And Lewis is supportive of that and makes sure
Mhm.
he gets out to see him when he can. So I think that there's a very close and carefully cultivated familial structure that much of this would have been difficult to imagine without that.
Mhm. Let's talk about life on the track. As we speak, preseason testing for 2025 is going on in Bahrain. Lewis is right there in his new Ferrari seat, fastest of all, I think, on day 2 of the testing. Are you willing to predict that Lewis will win races and further championships at Ferrari?
Yeah, I would like to predict that. I try to separate myself from being a fan of Lewis's, and to your point, right? He was, I think, fascinating. Like Carlos Sainz ended up like I think 3/100 second a second
Mhm.
in the second session faster, but he's right there, and I think as he familiarizes himself with the car, and I think his relationship with Frederic Vasseur is important here, right? Because they've been, you know, the kind of long relationship they have and the trust that's important. So I think much of the growing pains and leaving, you know, a lifetime of Mercedes powered drives to go to Ferrari, which has to be very different. I think that trust was important, and I think at the age that he is now, and you know, this is the race that any athlete has is you try to race between it's a foot race between everything that you know about the sport and everything that you can produce in the sport, right? So there's this
Mhm.
sweet spot where, you know, if Lewis knew back in 2007 what he knows in 2020 2025, he'd be a much different, you know, we'd have much different results, but that's not how the world works, right?
Right.
So I think there's a very small window, and
Mhm.
I'm excited and also gratified by what I've seen just with his reception at Ferrari and also the results that we've seen on the track where they seem to have their act together. So then, you know, it comes down to being able to put races together, right? Because at this point, you've got three drivers out there who've actually won world championships, and you know, Fernando Alonso's far away from that possibility. I
Yeah.
think, you know, obviously Max Verstappen, we'll have to see what Max does with a car that doesn't seem to be in superior position this year, like it has been in the past couple of years. But then you have a bunch of drivers who've won races but haven't been able to string enough of them together or a season together to do what Lewis figured out how to do almost his first year. And we know that he can produce that type of result. So I think much of it will come down to, you know, the
Mhm.
slog of a season, right? Where you know, and can he push the sun back up in the sky one more time or two more times and be able to pull this off with the car that gives him that possibility. So I'm excited about it.
I was testing you there. You got the information right about Sainz being quickest and the beleaguered Williams in the second session, but Lewis is right there. Let's talk about Lewis off the track just a little bit. Uh, I've been covering Formula One since 1987.
Okay.
Along comes this phenomenon, Lewis Hamilton, along with a cadre of other great young drivers, including Nico Rosberg, who was his junior series perhaps closest friend, but then his biggest rival on track when they were teammates of Mercedes. In all of the years covering Lewis, it seemed to me the feedback that I got from viewers was pretty evenly split. Half of them saying, why do you have to mention all the time that Lewis is black? Haven't we moved past that as a society, as a culture? The other half was, you have to mention more often that Lewis is black because this is a pivotal moment in the society and the culture. Is that the world we're living in right now when it comes to people with this extraordinary level of talent?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, Lewis, for a lot of different reasons, and I don't know if you had a chance, the Time Magazine article that came out today, he's very specific about this, right? He says that he's not to be compared because they were bringing up the critique he's taken from, you know, Bernie Ecclestone, who says whatever he's going to say whenever he's going to say it. I guess, you know, this is kind of doesn't much of it is meaningless and also pretty harmful. But Lewis said, I'm not listening to old people because there's never been somebody like me. He says, you know, I'm the first black person in sport, so I'm used to adversity. So this is not new. And, you know, you ought not be comparing me to other people. So I think
Mhm.
part of it is Lewis is never, once he got beyond the way his dad had situated, you know, thinking about and being involved with his race in particular, I think he's been
Mhm.
very unapologetic about saying, you know, you need to understand that I'm a black person and what that all means, right? What that means for being inside the sport and what that means for being outside of the sport. And he's
Mhm.
firm about that. But yeah, I think, people who, it's not, and this is, my kind of professional hat as a person who professionally is writes and thinks about these kinds of questions of race in the world, right? It's
Mhm.
it's just not realistic to say that you're going to pretend like this isn't true. It doesn't make any sense, and it shouldn't be necessary because it's not. He's not saying it in order to demean anyone. He's saying it in order to uplift people, right? Which is a completely different approach. And so I think it's important to pay attention to that and to also not be willing to back off of putting that in conversation with what's going on. So that's kind of my point I approach it.
Sure. Yeah, as you point out, Lewis is right in saying that you really can't compare me to others because, I'm me, I'm different. I'm a particular individual who has a very different experience from a lot of the people I find myself competing with and working around and so forth. Um, you are a literary scholar. Um, can you compare Lewis to any other character, real or imagined? And he is so unique. Do you liken him to anyone else in the world that we've seen thus far?
Yeah, and this has kind of come up as I've been thinking about it and starting these kinds of conversations. In many ways, what I'm doing in the book is looking at Lewis in the same way I look at a piece of literature, right? In order to kind of parse it and kind of give some description of what's going on. But I
Mhm.
think Lewis to me is most uh, comparable to a type of artist, really. And in my mind, it comes down to thinking about someone like Jean-Michel Basquiat, right, who's producing a particular type of art that is
Mhm.
so unique and has a particular reception. You recognize it immediately, and I think that's and the kind of gravitas and uh, just charisma that Basquiat had that we see even now. That then after his untimely death or whatever, the reception of his art has exceeded even his wildest imaginations, right? So I think Lewis, to me, basically situates himself in that type of cultural milieu. Uh,
Mhm.
Other literary figures, you have to get to thinking about the hero, and I think this is what George Lucas in the relationship with Lucas is right about. When he says that heroes are bigger than champions, because Lewis takes the high road, right? And
Yes.
even in the most difficult moments. And one of the things, people will say, obviously he has a carefully cultivated public personality, persona, right? But I think in that moment in 2021, when he gets out of that car and walks over and congratulates Max Verstappen, there's no way to fake that, right? There's no possible way that, I probably would have gotten out and thrown the helmet across the, kicked the car,
Wouldn't we
run to
all?
yeah, right. Run to the steward's office, complained, and not been able to participate in ways that are positive in celebrating Verstappen, who deserved to win the championship, but not like that, right? And I think
Yeah.
it's the best way to describe it. So I
Yeah.
think he's heroic in those kinds of ways, and
Mhm.
not to pretend like I don't he's a human being, right? There's probably all kinds of reasons, but I think that what he's done and the what he's produced for us to kind of observe from the outside, it's a very special moment to be able to have watched, as you're saying, from '87 to where we're at now, right? To kind of watch this
Right.
develop and
Yeah.
see how Formula One develops, right? And I think Lewis, in many ways, is a lot like in sports is a lot like Michael Jordan. There are a lot of people who didn't win championships because of Lewis Hamilton, right? That their
Mhm.
careers, I think, and you mentioned Nico Rosberg, right? He pulled that off one time and didn't want any part of what was required anymore, which is
Right.
an honorable thing to do. I get it, right? He
Mhm.
did it one time and was like, I can't go through that again. And I think, to me, I think Fernando Alonso would have won more championships had it not been for Lewis Hamilton. He probably would have been in a position to win that in 2007, maybe at McLaren, right? The car obviously was ready. But I
Yeah.
think that the kind of effect of this person's career puts him in that kind of category as both a kind of spoiler for certain people that you
Mhm.
feel terrible when you go back and look at it, right? But then also kind of heroic figure who doesn't shy away from difficult causes, tasks, or taking on more challenges.
Fair to say, there's probably a lot of fans out there who don't realize, and I'll use a phrase that I saw in your materials. Lewis represents a new kind of black cosmopolitan. Here we go. Cosmopolitanism. He is co-chairing the Met Gala. He's involved in music and recording. He's involved in movie making now, and on and on and on. Um, Aside from where he finds the time, which is another secret, I guess I'll leave with him. Um, what can be done? How long is it going to take before people realize what they're looking at? I used to talk about Michael Schumacher, and before him, Ayrton Senna, when people would say, "Oh, this is no fun. Formula One's no fun. The same
Right.
guys are winning all the races." And I told them, "Yeah, but you're going to want to say you were there to see this person do what they do."
Absolutely.
Mhm.
So I think, and this is back to being a literary scholar, right? If you've been, can you imagine like having been fortunate enough to go to the Globe when like Shakespeare was producing these plays? You just go down there and kind of see it, right? And you may have not, maybe
Yeah,
Macbeth wasn't your thing, or maybe, whatever the case, right?
right.
But you were there, right, when it happened, right? And whether you
Exactly.
realized it or not,
Hmm.
that's the thing, right? Now, so I think, and what I try to use that term, right, this kind of new black cosmopolitanism is just that, right? And this is what I was saying, where Lewis is different than Ali, because Ali lost the kind of most important years of his career with his activism, right?
Hmm.
And also Ali, made money, but he never made the kind of money or had the kind of commercial success because, from being where you're at down in Atlanta, people read Ali's career backwards from the Atlanta Olympic Games, where I'm old enough to remember and grew up where people despised Muhammad Ali. And
Yeah.
yeah, and I've never forgotten that, right? Because, and so I think it's an important moment. And I think this is, to me, this is what's important about where you mentioned how do we understand what's going on with him at Ferrari. It'd be great
Hmm.
if he wins more championships. I think it would be, to see Lewis celebrate at Imola, with the Tifosi would be amazing in certain ways, right? But
Uh-huh.
and I would bet that probably happens. But
Hmm.
whether he wins a championship or not, I don't think is going to be the measure of whether this is successful or not, because the long durée of what we're watching has been
Hmm.
so beautiful. I mean, and, it's Italian. It's like the Italian Renaissance with Michelangelo showing up at the end of his career to paint the Last Judgment, right? The front of, he had done
Hmm.
the Sistine Chapel ceiling 20 some years before, and like he gets called back there. He produces this thing. It's like, whoa, it's different. He
Right.
had been painting for a while, the whole thing, right? So I think it's in that realm, and I think it's the romance and the putting the pieces together to have him end up at Ferrari in this kind of impossible moment. And I
Hmm.
felt terrible for Carlos Sainz. I think Carlos Sainz is a person who could very easily win a world championship, uh,
Hmm.
and having him to have to move over, and I've seen Carlos Sainz say positive things about Lewis being at Ferrari, right? He thinks, and I think that is commendable for all, and for those athletes who lived through this era. I think
Right.
when it's all over, they'll have very positive things to say about their time driving with and against Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah. I must say, one of the things I enjoyed about your writing style is that you did not write a book about Lewis is great, everybody else comes up short. You give credit where credit's due, even to Lewis's edgiest rivals, Fernando Alonso in his day, Max Verstappen in the current era. These are athletes who have produced great achievements in their careers, and you give them full credit for that before exploring the relationships that they find themselves in with the phenomenon that is Lewis Hamilton.
No, I appreciate that, and I think that's part of what I'm saying about what Lewis in produces gives us something to look at from a positive perspective, right? Like I think
Mhm.
it's easy to like, do the villain and the hero thing in some ways, right? And I think that you have to be more incisive and careful about that. So I appreciate that came off in the book for your reading of it.
Absolutely. One final question. What would you like your readers to take away from this book? What is your goal in addressing them the way you do in the book?
Yeah, I think to give, this is where we start an interview, right? To have a point of pause to then be able to watch this last part of his career, right? To kind of absorb all these things that we've talked about, whether it's the relationship with his father, relationship with his family, what the kind of long difficult road to get to Formula One, all these things, right? Then be able to enjoy these last couple of years in ways that I think are richer for having that kind of information, and then understand these other figures that are around, right? That are still echoes in his life, right? So when we hear Nico Rosberg comment on a Saturday, we have the context to know that these people were friends and went through this very difficult period of time. But now Lewis gives his daughters every year, right? It's like, to kind of see, kind of the rough and tumble aspects of it. So it really, I want the book to serve as a point of rest for a second, and then be able to kind of view this last part of what I think is a beautiful career. And I hope it ends on a kind of positive note. We'd like to see our favorite athletes walk away from the sport on top, right? And it's hard for that to happen, but it may actually happen, hopefully.
Absolutely. Lewis is opening up Formula One, the way baseball, football, basketball, all those different sports became so much better when the opportunity was there for athletes of every walk of life. Michael, I want to thank you for your time. The book is called Sir Lewis. It's published by Legacy Lit. It goes on the bookstore shelves March 4th, if I'm right.
Absolutely.
And I highly recommend it. Thanks once again, Michael.
Thanks a lot, Bob. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.